Well, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for being today. I know some of you are making quite a big effort and sacrificing your good sleep, and thank you especially for that. The topic today is technology. The whole session today will be devoted to our technology matters. So we'll hear both from Brian and from Rich, in turn, Technology Working Group and the task force. And I must note and thank very much Misha Peters, who has been assisting our technology initiative for quite some time now, seconded from the New Zealand colleagues. Thank you for being with us, Misha, and for all the help you've done. I understand that this is probably your the last time you're meeting with us, and I want to thank you very much in advance for all your contributions and say we appreciate it very much, and we look forward to our crossing paths again. So let me turn, I believe that Brian is going to start. Is that so?
Yes, sir.
All right. So Brian, you have the floor, and thank you.
Thanks. And Cam's just going to share the slides here for us. Excelente. All right. Yeah, so great. Thanks, Stavros, and good day, everyone. I think I'm using the term day in its loosest sense for some of you, as I know I experienced yesterday. So I'll begin the technology presentation and discussion, walking through some of the transitional elements of the initiative and the activities related to the working group. And then, as Stavros mentioned, I'll pass over to Rich, who will carry on with the update that's specific to the task force's work. We'll really, of course, both be available to comment or address questions throughout as needed, given that these two groups have to work fairly closely together, at least with respect to the bigger picture, or even the medium picture, if you will. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a reminder of the composition of the two teams making up the technology initiative. Earlier in the quarter, I transitioned the chair role for the task force over to Rich, but otherwise there were no additional changes during the first quarter here. The task force has met several times since the last board meeting, principally to chart the way forward in light of the bifurcation of the technology stream, as well as to more fully digest and evaluate the results of the two surveys from the fourth quarter of 2020. As to the working group, we've also met several times in the past few months to draft our proposed terms of reference, in addition to beginning our work on identifying and prioritizing non-authoritative material topics, discussing collaboration partners, and then also jumping into some of the outreach and work to develop our first non-authoritative materials. Perhaps jumping the gun, if you will, considering that we're looking to have our terms of reference approved today. Okay, next slide, please. So the objectives of this session are to recap what's been happening with the technology project over the past quarter. First off is to share some contextual information on the separation of workstream elements, followed by consideration of the Planning Committee's recommendation to defer the Tech Task Force's exposure draft, an idea that was preliminarily raised and socialized during the December board meeting. Following this is for the board to consider that pre-circulated draft terms of reference for the new technology working group and to provide any comments on or feedback on these. And then finally, from the task force perspective, Rich will provide an update and then report back on the key messages returned from respondents to the two technology surveys, as you'll remember, on complexity and independence, and look to receive feedback on how the task force will make use of that information to advance its drafting work. Next slide, please. So by way of update on the first quarter's kind of overall technology-related activities, I've already mentioned that the working group was established and convened several times to lay the groundwork for our activities, as well as to begin the work itself. Also during the quarter, the planning committee, the task force, and working group each reflected on some of the issues that were raised and discussed at the December board meeting, several of which arose through meetings and conversations with stakeholders throughout last year, but especially in the fourth quarter. And the general themes, the ones that are shown here in the middle of the slide, relate to increased concerns around capacity and resources during the pandemic, the general pace issues related to code changes and implementation, and also the feedback and information that has and continues to come in with respect to technology, whether that's through outreach or research or the surveys. So this backdrop led to active conversations within these groups and then culminated in the planning committee inviting both the task force and working group to present their thoughts on how best to progress the task force work in accordance with its project plan, what the scope of the working group activities would look like, and then importantly, how the teams would coordinate to meet the objectives of IESBA's tech initiative. And the results of that meeting fed directly into the TWG's proposed terms of reference and also resulted in a recommendation related to the timing of the task force's exposure draft that I'll speak to in a few slides. And then last week, the working group and task force had an excellent session with the IESBA CAG, and at that meeting, CAG members expressed support for separating the initiative into these two work streams and also reiterated the importance of developing various non-authoritative materials in this area, particularly given the timeline of when changes to the code might be expected, and certainly also looking to be responsive to what other stakeholders have mentioned to us about the topics that professional accountants in both business and public practice will find valuable. And to that end, CAG members also echoed some of the specific topics that we've identified so far, and we're looking forward to speaking with a couple of them about additional detail and also possibly working together. So there was also agreement with the deferral of the exposure draft to provide at least some period of stability, though it should be noted that Shigeo, representing the PIOB, did caution against delaying much beyond what is being recommended today. Again, we'll get to that a few slides from now. Then there was also continued support for higher level drafting of proposed code changes to ensure the longevity of those changes being made. Naturally, that's always been an objective of the Tech Task Force, so that's just supporting that. And then finally, the CAG provided some feedback on the survey results summary, but I'll let Rich comment on feedback from the CAG on that within his section when he deems that appropriate. But Galen, perhaps I can just ask you at this point whether there's anything that you'd like to add in terms of the CAG feedback that you took away from last week. If there's anything I missed or something you want to add.
No, Brian, I think that there was a lot of support at the CAG, some concerns about the delay, I think, which is consistent with what you've already covered, but a lot of interest in the FAQs going forward. A little bit of concern about two work streams and the coordination between the two, making sure that they're tracking and working together and not at odds with one another, which I don't expect to happen, but that was raised.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for that. Definitely issues that are top of mind for us moving forward, things that we were obviously already sort of wrestling with how to work out the processes, particularly around coordination between the two groups throughout the first quarter. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so then jumping into that kind of issue, looking at how the two teams are expecting to work with one another and also with stakeholders, the task force will continue to evaluate how and where code changes should be implemented. So concentrating on the specific drafting as it has for just about the past year now. The working group on the right-hand side there will accelerate the development of non-authoritative guidance and educational materials in relation to technology and its impact on the ethical decision-making of professional accountants. And then in addition, the TWG, so the working group, will also look deeper at some of the technologies that have not yet been examined in depth during this initiative. So in other words, those ones that the TWG Phase 1 work of 2019 had deferred. Note that both of these components of the new tech working group's scope were activities that the tech task force had been sort of trying to do off the side of its desk, so to speak, for parts of 2020. But as the tech task force is now quite deep into its drafting process, it was really felt that that's what kind of initiated being the right time to allocate resources specifically to non-authoritative material development, as well as to continue advancing additional research on other technology topic domains. Obviously, this is not an area that stands still. And then in the center of the illustration are the information sources that both groups will be drawing insights from. As they include many of the same sources to some degree, this clearly is one of the areas that requires a strong coordinated effort to ensure that we're not duplicating activities. Some of the activities are fairly easily delineated. Desk research, fact-finding, collaboration with IFAC are principally related to the technology working group, whereas coordinating with the IESBA, socializing and receiving feedback on specific code changes are principally activities that fall to the task force. But some of the other information sources are more overlapping. So for example, the surveys, although primarily the domain of the task force, there are opportunities for the working group to draw information from the results for inclusion in some of the non-authoritative material as well. And there's also benefits to both groups in having discussions with the NAS and FEES rollout working group, and similarly the need for both groups to continue outreach with NSS, PAOs, and other stakeholders. But we recognize that when it comes to discussions and broader outreach, we'll need to carefully synchronize our efforts so that we don't overburden stakeholders with unnecessary separate outreach requests from these two very related teams, especially considering that feedback from many stakeholders last year that they're already feeling overburdened. And then recognizing this need for coordination, both the task force and working group will be supported by the same IESBA staff, namely Cam Leung, and also additional support from Deanne Jules. And we have one individual who is a member of both the task force and the working group, and that be myself. And in addition, the IAASB's liaison member, Joanna Field, who has attended a couple of meetings already, will at various times be participating in both working group and task force meetings, depending on what's being discussed and sort of what's happening at the IAASB's technology working group at the time as well. And then to further encourage collaboration, all of the task force and working group meetings are open to members from the other team on an optional basis. I do need to stress that because I know our team members are listening. So recognizing that obviously it would be a substantial commitment to participate in both meetings of both groups, and also given some very real time zone constraints that we're working with. And then finally, we've got the use of Microsoft Teams to aggregate and share the results of the technology initiative's desk research and the information that's being gathered through outreach and other activities. That's been active since early last year, and it will simply continue, albeit now with a larger group. So before I move on from here, I know Stavros already said that, but I also really want to publicly recognize and thank Misha Peters. As mentioned, has been on secondment from the New Zealand XRB and very ably supporting the work of the Tech Task Force since right near its inception. And we're really sorry to see that Misha's time with us here on the tech project is coming to an end. I've also worked with Misha on the E-Code and successful launch of that. So thanks very kindly to Misha and also to the XRB for their generosity. Okay, so I'll pause in a second and take some questions if there are any, but I also wanted to let Rich chime in as the Tech Task Force chair in the event that he's got any additional comments to add related to the Tech Task Force components of the first few slides.
I would just emphasize that I think the concept that we're going to collaborate very carefully is something we spent a reasonable amount of time thinking through. The sources of information and the the various initiatives will inform both. And some of the efforts around non-authoritative materials, for example, may cause us to think further about the potential changes to the code. And certainly some of the things I know we've talked about around in the task force and jointly with Brian around things that came up in the survey results, and we'll highlight those in a moment or later in the day. But clearly reference the need for some non-authoritative materials where that will be beneficial.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich. Okay, next slide, please. And so it's over to the board if there's any questions at this stage.
Comments from the board? If you have any, please raise hand.
If not, no
Don't
problem.
see any, Brian.
No, please go on.
Sounds good. It's not your last opportunity, so not to worry. All right. Next slide then. Thanks, Cam. Okay, so as I alluded to a couple of times, and as you'll have noted in the agenda papers, the IESBA Planning Committee met earlier this year with Rich and I to discuss both the proposed work plans for the TWG and the TTF moving forward, as well as the TTF's timeline. And as a result of that discussion, there's a recommendation being made from the Planning Committee to the board to defer the Tech Task Force's exposure draft for a period of 6 months, moving the approval timeframe, targeted approval timeframe, from June 2021 to December 2021. And although this suggestion initially began in response to expressed concerns from stakeholders around pandemic workloads, in our discussions, it was also noted that this would provide at least a slightly longer period of stability to permit the implementation of the NAS and fees changes that are scheduled for release at the end of April, subject to PIOB approval, of course. This change will also permit the Tech Working Group to work more collaboratively with the NAS Rollout Working Group by better aligning the timelines between the two initiatives, and to be able to show how at least some of the NAS changes have a crossover impact with the technology area. It also permits more flexibility in the working group's efforts to develop non-authoritative materials to meet stakeholder demands, as well as with respect to collaborating across the tech initiative as the working group shares its initial research and findings on some of those other technology domains with the Tech Task Force for their consideration as they continue to advance their drafting. I will note, of course, though, that throughout 2020, as the Tech Task Force was doing its own drafting work, it was at least still mindful of these other technology areas. It's not that when you talk to stakeholders that they're able to mentally just separate or silo out big data, data analytics, and AI from the other areas of technology. So there certainly was, there's some cross-anticipation already within the drafting that's been put through as sort of those straw man drafts and so on to take that into account. But it's now just to try to confirm some of those or not, depending on what the outputs of the research are. Okay, next slide, please. And then just the rationale for recommending that 6-month deferral at the Planning Committee, it was really based on the strong progress that has been made to date on the suggested changes to the code directionally, including when reflecting on the feedback to the straw man draft wording that was circulated to the board at its December meeting, the feedback received through the 2 surveys and how it aligns with both the task force's preliminary views and also the views of stakeholders that were received during more detailed outreach over the past really 2 years, because it really started with the Tech Working Group Phase 1. Also the reasons for deferring in the first place, what I just covered on the previous slide, and then also the fact that we have 7 board members who are rotating off at the end of this year, which will obviously have an impact on the continuity of working with this material and the familiarity of working with this material. So 6 months seemed to be the right answer recognizing that there's no perfect answer in terms of a deferral, but that seemed to be the right balance between these different factors. Okay, and then next slide, please. And then just for additional context, the proposed deferral leads to the revised indicative timing that's shown here on the slide, whereby the June IESBA meeting would then now involve discussing issues that remain outstanding prior to the first read of proposals to both the CAG and the board in September. Target ED approval would be at the year-end meeting this year, and then that then predicates the timing for the first read to the board post-exposure in December 2022, and a target of March 2023 for the final pronouncement of standards changes. So this is very much a task force matter. Just let me pause here, and I'd really like to get Rich to see if he wants to chime in and comment before we hear from the board on this issue.
Sorry, I'm having a little technology problem, but Brian, I think for me and some of the discussions, both with the planning committee and in the task force, is very important changes have been made to the code with NAS and fees, and particularly NAS, and I'll highlight something that came out of the survey on that a little later. That it's important that we see the implementation and we understand how that is going and what they're hearing from that in our consideration of what we might want to advance if in terms of code change. And there was, I'll say a bit more of a, there's been a lot of feedback about overload of standards. Some of that is driven by COVID, as Brian alluded to, but some of it seems to be a digestibility kind of issue. There was some feedback from the CAG that, more limited changes to the code would be better in some people's view. That wouldn't necessarily be everybody's view. And we feel it's very important that we understand and see how particularly the NAS implementation goes and the things that are learned through that, as well as Brian has a chance to get some non-authoritative material out, which he has an aggressive plan to do. And there are some of the matters left to be dealt with from the task force perspective are the thorniest matters, and you'll see some of that when we get to some of the survey results. So I think there was wide support, as Brian, I can't remember if you alluded to this or not. There was some who felt we should go as far as a year out. But I think that the time frame here is aggressive but doable, and I'm told that the final March of 2023 is in fact equally only 6 months beyond the original plan. Perhaps from my perspective, it might, if possible, maybe we can squeeze some time out between ED comments were being received and the final pronouncement to help accelerate that a bit. So I'll pause there and turn it back to you, Brian.
Great, thanks, Rich. Yeah, and in fact, just in terms of some of the timing that was suggested, we heard really anywhere from 3 months to 18 months, which was a very significant range. But in any event, 6 months is where the recommended proposal landed. So if we can move to the next slide, that is the queue once again for board members. We can get your thoughts on the revised timeline and when what that looks like in terms of the approval of the release of the Tech Task Force exposure draft.
Thank you, Brian. Board members, please raise hands if you have any questions. Cam, perhaps if I could ask you just to put it back to the previous slide so the board members can see the timeline. We have a couple of hands raised. Lisbeth?
Yes, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, my sense is that I'm not convinced that delaying till December is really the right answer. And the reason why is, well, our stakeholders have clearly asked for a period of calm and stability. And just delaying with 6 months, is that really giving them enough time to get that period they're asking for? Does that mean that we shouldn't be doing anything? No, not at all. What I think the focus of the task force and the working group at this moment should be is non-authoritative material, and really identifying through the survey the areas where we think that there is a need for further help with interpreting how the new NAS standard will apply in a technological environment, so that we can really demonstrate that even these new revised standard on NAS is assisting the stakeholders in getting to the right answer. And that will also be very useful to demonstrate that our principles-based code is written in such a good way that we don't need that many changes to the code anymore. I'm really concerned by tinkering the code too much, just making changes for the purpose of making changes. I really don't like that. I think we have a very good, strong code, especially now with the NAS standard. And I think a non-authoritative material, together with the rollout of the NAS standard, so the project that Kim was presenting yesterday, because that would fall most of it in the third quarter of the year. If you can combine those two, I think you will have much more effect than trying to come to an ED, which is then brand new to everyone, and all the stakeholders have to focus on that again. I saw that one of the reasons was that there are 7 members rotating off. Well, one is myself, actually, but is it really fair to the new incoming members that they haven't had a chance to give their input into this ED? We know that usually after the ED goes out, there aren't that many changes anymore as a result of the comments. So they will have to vote on the final standard. So I think they deserve a moment to give input as well. And I think it will still work within the indicative timeline, because when I was looking at that December 21 sending out an ED, and then December 22 only a first read, I don't think I've ever have seen a year to comment to work with the comments from stakeholders. So if we would go for a 9 months, that's what I would propose. But meanwhile, really focus on non-authoritative materials with a focus on area where there is misunderstanding, but because I think there is some indication of that based on the results of the survey.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Caroline, you're next.
Thanks, Jeff. Brian and Rich, thanks for your presentation so far. I agree with Lisbeth that the focus should be on non-authoritative material being developed in this part of the time, and for that reason, I'm supportive of the timeline being pushed out on the exposure draft. But when I reflect, this project has actually started for some time already, and the members of the technology task force are essentially unchanged from prior to Rich coming in as the chair. And they have done quite a significant part of the work with the survey results, helping to inform the way forward in terms of what changes to the code are necessary. And maybe at this point in time, maybe talking about the timeline might be jumping the gun a bit, because we ought to maybe think of or hear from Rich what the task force is thinking of in terms of, having looked at the survey results. So I'm supportive of an extension of time, but I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're not starting from when the change in the construct of the task force has occurred. We're really starting from back when we approved the technology project. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Brian, we might take one more comment first before I ask you to respond. Andy, you're next.
Thank you. So I guess I'm speaking a little bit disappointed for a delay in the project, but 6 months is one I think I can live with. I think we do have a strong code. I think we made it stronger recently with additional pronouncements, which I think proves the concept that we can improve our already strong code with additional standard setting. So I think there's been a lot of momentum with the working group and as where it's been going over time. I think the moment is now for enhanced enhancements to the code for this topic. I think we don't have a proposal to look at. I think the proof will be when the task force comes forward with their proposed ED. I think I'm confident, especially given this delay, which again I'm a little disappointed too, but I understand the realities. I think there will be a forceful and appropriate paper. So I guess I just wanted to not be silent on the aspect of I would hope there wouldn't be any further delay on this. I think it's important, and I think improvements will enhance the public interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Brian, we might take one more comment from Yance, and I'll ask you to address the other comments. Yance.
Thank you. I would like to remember that the NIS project has included some of the technology issues, and we postponed them because we want to discuss them in a total context of technology. And that's why I agree with Andy and Caroline that we are not starting the project now from scratch. So it is a developing project which we outsourced or centralized in this technology working group and task force. And that's why it is wise, in my opinion, to make a first exposure draft in the context of NIS and with the knowledge of all of our discussion at board level on the NIS final document. And that's why I think a 6 months delay is appropriate, but we are by that keeping the knowledge and information which we have shared in the previous discussions also in this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Yance. Brian and Rich, you have the floor.
Thanks. Well, maybe I'll just start off here, and I know that really some of these questions probably should be addressed by Rich as well. I think what was just highlighted is, and there's a bit of divergence of views, and I think we can see the balance that we all have been struggling with here in terms of the stakeholder demands for period of stability. There's a lot of workload and so on and so forth, and yet there's also, Jens, exactly what you pointed out, that when the NAS task force was concluding its sort of first reads of its work, there was a deliberate carve-off of the technology components to be addressed as a priority item by the tech task force. And so there's more urgency, obviously, that is imparted by that sort of messaging. And so 6 months, I think it's a good way that several people have said. It's something that I think we can live with, given the practical realities of the work that needs to be done, and what stakeholders are indicating are primary concerns for them. So again, I don't think that there is an absolutely right answer, that we can come up with the correct answer, but this seemed to be the best answer that came out through the various discussions. With respect to the development of non-authoritative materials around NAS, yes, that's absolutely a priority item, and we'll see. I mean, I'll get to that shortly here when we talk about the tech working group and its focus and so on. And working with the NAS and fees rollout working group is obviously paramount in that area. Just non-authoritative, in my opinion, is not going to solve the technology issues as they relate to NAS. Certainly there were important changes that took place with respect to the new drafting, the new provisions within NAS. However, those are largely oriented toward PIEs. So we still have the whole area of non-PIs, which is of course quite large. There's also other areas where some clarification really ought to happen within the code, because if we made some of these declarations, and I'll just give you an example, within non-authoritative material, if we just opine that whether a non-assurance service is performed by staff within the firm or a technology that the firm is using or has developed itself, that the NAS provisions equally apply, that seems to me anyway to be something that should be authoritative and not non-authoritative. So, and if it's not clear, and I know Rich will get to this in terms of the survey, if it's not clear to stakeholders, then we really need to provide that clarity. But it doesn't seem like that should happen simply outside of the code. We can definitely message to that effect, but there kind of needs to be some authority to say, yeah, no, that absolutely is the view of the board. Again, that's something that stakeholders are requesting. That's something that the Tech Task Force has been putting forward in the past. We have some, support for that as well within the survey. But that's a matter still to be addressed within the drafting. You saw a straw man draft of that in December. But there's still work to be done in that area. So the long and the short of it is, I agree, the production of NAM and the drafting that's contemplated by the TTF need to work hand in hand, and also with some of the other groups that are currently moving forward with their initiatives. The tax group, Yance, yours would be one. If we think about issues around complexity, for example, that we've talked about in the past, things like that. So I think we can work more collaboratively that way, and this timeline change, I think, will allow that to happen and allow the NAS and fees rollout working group to really get going as well, and for us to work together.
Thanks, Brian. Rich, did you have any comments to follow up? We do have a few other raised hands at this point.
Why don't we take the other questions?
Okay. Ken, you have a comment?
Thank you, Jeff. I just wanted to provide a bit more information and context to the board. What is being discussed really is a matter of striking the right balance. There is a tension between what we're hearing from stakeholders in the context of COVID, all the pressures, the perception of standards overload, etc., as Brian has set out. On the other side, we have heard of a concern. In fact, when we had our conversation with the PIUB staff last Friday, they really raised this concern as to how the board would be reconciling the message in the strategy and work plan, and that is a very strong message about the importance and the priority that ought to be given to really addressing issues of technology, and the timeline then of the project going forward. And they struggle a bit to really understand how to reconcile, if you will, that difference between, as I said, the importance that's accorded to technology in the strategy and work plan, and the extension of the timeline, and therefore with the potential delay in delivering any potential enhancements to the code. So there is a tension there, and it is a matter of balance the board has to really think about and strike.
Thank you, Ken. Laurie, you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say Ken's comment, I think, is very helpful for me and sort of crystallize. I mean, I think this pandemic point, most of us in our businesses are seeing that, the time delays and the exhaustion from all the efforts going on. But I do think finding that balance and keeping things moving while we have a lot of people who are existing and have been invested in those discussions is important. And this feels like a pretty reasonable balance, at least from where we sit today. That's all.
Thank you, Laurie. Andy, your hand is still up. Did you have a follow-up comment?
My fault, sorry.
Thank you. Stavros, do you have a comment?
Yes, just a word. Well, what Laurie and Ken and others said about balance is, of course, a very important point. But I would like to remind the board that the technology project is one of our most important strategic projects, and we've said so in our plan. And there is a lot of expectations from a variety of stakeholders that will produce something. Now, clearly, COVID and the other circumstances, the fact that we have just finished the NAS and we're trying to roll it out, present some obstacles, but we should also be careful not to give the impression that we're sort of putting off technology. I think that we should avoid that impression. In any case, I think it's too early to talk about timelines before we also hear Rich, and then maybe if there are additional comments on that, we can revisit. But from what I hear, and I too believe that we should strike this balance because it is a very important strategic project, and there are a lot of perceptions and expectations from IESBA about that.
Thank you, Stavros. Our PR will be observer Jane. You had your hands up earlier, but you put it down. So do you still have a comment or question for Brian and Rich and the task force? You're mute.
I'll wait until I've heard the Richard's presentation. Thank you. But I have a few comments I'd like to make at the end. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Ken, your hand is still up. Did you have a follow-up comment?
No, thank you. I'll take my hand down. Thank you.
Okay, Brian, so we'll pass it back to you.
Sounds great. I know Rich wanted to hear additional comments before he commented. I don't know if you want to do that now, Rich, or...
Yeah, I'll just come at it a little differently. I think the practical reality is December is the most likely that we get a quality document in position, having given chance for a first read at the September meeting for the board. You'll maybe get a sense for some of that from the survey too. We'd also hope to I would hope to maybe let board members have some more input in some areas. We probably need some help on some views so that we don't have a lot of diversity in thought by the time we get to a first draft, and certainly an ED. But I think some of that will come out in the next sections.
Got it. Okay, thanks. So Cam, if we can jump on a couple of slides at this point, I guess. There we go. Great. Okay. So moving on to the technology working group's proposed terms of reference then. So the details are obviously contained in agenda item 4B, and I've also shared some of our coordination thoughts earlier, but sort of at a glance, the two main branches of the working group activities are shown here in these two columns. So first, with respect to non-authoritative materials, we're setting out to publish at least 4 pieces of non-authoritative guidance during 2021, either with collaborative partners, such as IFAC, PAOs, NSSs, academics, and so forth, or where appropriate, independently. So the TWG putting these items out. So the topic areas that the working group is recommending are those components where over the past, better part of the past year, the TTF, we've identified that the text in the code already appears to address the contemplated area, but where guidance would be helpful to augment the code or to provide additional relevant context for users, or perhaps to give tangible examples of how it applies. So in other words, we're aiming to help provide clarity for those situations where the principles-based nature of the code, as several folks have talked about already today, where that encapsulates a specific situation or application of technology as it relates to ethical decision-making, but where that might not be immediately obvious to users of the code. You'll note that the topic areas that are listed here on the left-hand side, they're very broad. That's so they can fit on the slide, things like ethical leadership and independence. Obviously, we're narrowing in to decide on specific elements of guidance within those broad topic areas, and we're certainly not planning on writing tomes on each one of these. That scoping and prioritization work is underway, and if you've got specific subtopics that you believe are especially relevant, important, timely, we'd absolutely like to receive those ideas. more detailed thoughts, again, if you flip back into the agenda paper, we've listed those within Appendix A. That's kind of where you see a bit of a breakdown of the four larger categories that we've got here on the slide. Okay, and then on the right-hand side, the other work that the working group will continue with is scanning emerging technology applications and use cases to identify and assess their impact on the behavior of professional accountants. And we'll be providing the IESBA with quarterly updates on our evaluation of topics, things like blockchain, cybersecurity, data governance. These are the areas that stakeholders continue to suggest to us as being the most important to consider for their potential impact on PA ethics, obviously other than AI and data analytics. And then much as we did in 2019 under the TWG Phase 1 work with AI and data analytics, the goal again is then to harvest actual examples where businesses, governments, firms, other organizations are making use of such technology, and then consider the current or potential impact on ethical decision-making and the behavior of PAs, and then once again, evaluating whether there might be gaps in the code for which we would recommend changes to be considered, or whether additional non-authoritative guidance materials appear to be a better fit. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then with respect to potential formats of NAM that we're thinking about, pretty much anything is on the table. It's dictated primarily by what format appears best suited for the information and the messaging that we're looking to communicate and to what audience. Probably the most common examples are listed here, going through the range of text-based documents with a leaning to shorter, more focused pieces that are frankly more likely to be read rather than end up on a shelf somewhere, or I guess occupying some quickly forgotten folder on a drive, as the case may be, and also through synchronous or asynchronous multimedia presentations. Importantly, the elements, things like scenarios and illustrative examples, questions to ask when managing technological changes and during implementation, as well as compiling insights from experienced stakeholders, those are all things that will form the core of each of these materials. It really needs to be about applied material. And then much as the NAS and FEES rollout team has done, as you heard from Kim, we've also had initial discussions with IFAC about setting up a dedicated web page for the dissemination of this and other material. And more detail of that will follow. Probably we'll have more information in June. Hopefully we'll even have a page by then. That would be cool. Okay, next slide, please. And then in terms of our approach to NAM, non-authoritative materials, as indicated in the terms of reference, we're looking to develop or facilitate the development of NAM. Honestly, there's a bias toward facilitating the development rather than independently producing the materials for the simple reasons that we don't have a huge amount of resources available to develop a lot of NAM ourselves. There's also a lot of areas to cover, and then through prior outreach, we are aware of a number of professional bodies and other organizations who are looking to develop such materials that align with the board's technology initiative's interests and also have the expertise and the capacity to do so. And so by facilitating through helping to scope topics, contributing parts of larger pieces where the lead organization is some other body, reviewing or suggesting content to be added from an IESBA perspective to more closely tie into the code's principles and provisions, adding ethics content to technology pieces where perhaps that was something that was not included or was only included in passing, things of that sort. If we do that, then we can leverage our more limited resources to extend IESBA's reach. So this is all to say that we are actively seeking collaborative opportunities as one of our high priorities. And then whether done in partnership or individually, once the topic has been scoped, the next decision is the appropriate format that's going to be worked toward. The intent with all of the NAM, as I said, is to focus on application, and to do that effectively, we need to ensure real or at least realistic use cases are included in the work and that they're tied to ethical decision making. Some of this is going to involve coordinating with the Technology Task Force, naturally, also with former NAS Task Force members, the NAS and Fees Rollout Working Group, the Tax Planning and Related Services Working Group, and so on, as appropriate, depending on the topic, to ensure that we've got consistent complementary messaging that's coming out from the board. Once drafted, for works in which the TWG is the lead, the thought is to circulate final draft content to the board or to members of the board and TAs for fatal flaw review. Normally, the idea would be to circulate such material out of session so that non-authoritative products don't consume undue meeting time during normal board meetings. Ultimately, this is obviously a process that's largely similar to that as was followed by the development of the COVID-19 NAM documents, and also the process that the NAS and Fees Rollout Working Group will be following, as Kim mentioned yesterday. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then just as an early example of collaboration on NAM, in January, IFAC, ICAS, and CPA Canada issued an exploratory thought piece on ethical leadership in an era of complexity and digital change that Laura and I co-authored, and that received contributions from all three of those organizations, as well as extra IESBA input from Deanne. This was followed at the beginning of February by a joint event with a very diverse group of global delegates, alongside the CEOs of all three sponsoring organizations who kicked off and wrapped up the event, all members of our TWG and a couple of task force members, either or both, presented or participated in the event. And in addition, the TWG, and to some extent representation from the TTF, will be involved in the authoring and or review of several non-authoritative guidance pieces arising from the detailed outputs that were gleaned from the breakout sessions at that event. And we're also contributing to the content on the IFAC Knowledge Gateway in the form of a higher level event summary. Again, it'll have some key points and some key takeaways, I guess, from that event. So each of these pieces and those paper components are related to subject areas that the TWG is committed to working in. The first paper is going to be on the topic of complexity. It's currently in the early stages of being drafted, with ones to follow on ethical leadership, with the focus on the challenges, opportunities related to technology in ethical decision-making, on the concerns around mis and disinformation, which includes highlighting objectivity, the importance of an inquiring mind and skepticism, as well as identifying and mitigating bias. And then finally, one on the importance of professional skills, values, attitudes, and ethics in an increasingly digitized world, with ties to integrity, professional competence and due care, and professional behavior. So this is just an example there of where IESBA is able to contribute some of its expertise and to a certain extent hitch its wagon to projects that, in this instance, CPA Canada and ICAS are pursuing as part of their broader consideration of the future of the profession. And it's these kinds of situations where the interests between different parties are well aligned, and those are the ones that we're keen to be involved with. Note also, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, IFAC has kindly already posted both the exploratory thought piece as well as the recording of the event on its event page if you're interested. I'll mention that there's a timeline in the YouTube description for that recording if you want to jump to particular parts that really interest you, because I know it is 3 hours. 3 hours is a long time to sit in front of YouTube, unless it's your favorite TV show. And then maybe just on a personal note, I'll just say, ICAS did a terrific job of managing the event production, which was super smooth. CPA Canada did great work in terms of designing the paper's look and feel. And then IFAC was really just stellar in terms of getting the word out to stakeholders and ensuring that we had such a large number of very engaged delegates. So all in all, solid team effort, something that we'd really like to build upon with other organizations. So this is the marketing piece as well. Okay, and then speaking of which, move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so as we continue on, the TWG has a number of irons in the fire, if you will, where we've had at least preliminary discussions with different organizations and have received expressions of interest in collaborating in one way or another. Some of these are, of course, early days. We're kind of just getting this process going, but the level of response that we've had so far and the interest in being involved in whether it's some kind of joint event or putting a document together has been extremely encouraging so far. So in addition to the groups that I've mentioned so far, we're currently also speaking with ACCA around issues dealing with confidentiality, data governance. They've got some current work that they have on the go that they're asking us to input into, and I won't steal their thunder too much. I'll let them release their items as they see fit, but we are working with them. The Accounting Professional and Ethical Standards Board in Australia and New Zealand, the Saudi Organization for CPAs, the IMA, and the Chinese Institute of CPAs have all expressed interest in some level of collaboration with the working group and with its activities. And then at the CAG meeting last week, we were also pleased to have Accountancy Europe provide some thoughts on priority topics from their perspective, and we're looking forward to further exploring that list with them. Last year there was the podcast that, well, I guess I was involved with, but really from a TTF perspective, so we're excited to continue that with the working group as well. And then with respect, I'll just quickly mention the IEEE, not a body probably a lot of people have had much to do with, being accountants, so the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. A couple of us had a follow-up call with them yesterday. They actually were speakers. We had invited them as speakers to that joint IFAC, ICAS, CPA Canada event, which was well received to have some leadership from the IEEE Standards Association there. So we had a follow-up call with them yesterday, and there was mutual agreement as to the need for our professions to determine how we can work together in tackling some of these difficult issues around technology and ethics. Obviously, this is not just an accounting issue. Clearly, this is something that pervades professions more broadly. And we see a real opportunity to collaborate between the data science folks, if you will, and professional accountants to identify and address ethical behavior as we all undertake our various roles as designers, users, budgeters, auditors of technology, among other things. So we've got plans for further discussions to see where the next opportunity to work together makes sense, but there are some ideas already in process there. And then we've also included on the slide a few other organizations that we're planning outreach with. We're in the process of finalizing plans for an IESBA Tech Initiative update with CPA Australia that Greg Driscoll and I will be taking part in. So it's kind of a joint TWG TTF webinar. There's a number of other outreach and speaking opportunities that are being pursued with the remaining organizations on the list here. Some have been booked, some are still in the proposal stage. And then just in terms of how we plan to prioritize these opportunities going forward and what other bodies or organizations we approach, we're really mindful of the benefits of diversity here on a number of fronts. And so we want to ensure that we have geographical/cultural representation that reaches beyond the more typical outreach areas. So we're actively sourcing opportunities, for example, in South America, Asia, and Africa. Initial communication has begun with each of those regions, so that's already positive. And we want to make sure that we're providing resources for both PAIBs and PAPPs across a range of goals and from a number of perspectives. There's excellent diversity on the board, and we're looking to leverage that. So stay tuned. I know some of us, or we've reached out to some of you already, and again, we've received very good response, so that's great. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then so at the beginning of my presentation, I presented the activities of the working group in two main branches or columns, and I've spent the past few slides here focusing on the first column, the development of non-authoritative materials. But before I wrap up, I just want to speak a little bit about the second branch, the information gathering activities. And I talked about the collaborative opportunities and upcoming outreach of different activities just now, but we'll be looking to conduct additional focused outreach to hear from some different stakeholders as well. We'll also be continuing our desk research on the different technology topics that I spoke about earlier, such as blockchain, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, and so on, which help to populate our already extensive database of curated resources on that team site that I was talking about. Going forward, we're watching for relevant events to attend or participate in, including tech-related conferences or symposia that help to build our own competence and understanding in this area. Again, obviously, this is not a field that stands still, so looking at things at a point in time is not very informative, even months or a year from today. And then finally, we've discussed the idea of commissioning academic or practical research if we find beneficial opportunities there, and again, and sort of the right dance partner, if you will. And then as we progress our research and fact-finding, one of our key objectives, of course, is to proactively monitor for areas where there might be gaps in the code or opportunities where clarity might be needed from a user's perspective. And then if so, those are the sorts of opportunities and discussions that we would first have with our tech task force colleagues as part of the ongoing communications. And then the task force and the working group might well put together a recommendation for the board's consideration. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so at this point, it's kind of like I'm taking a step back. So the working group has been doing a fair amount of work already. It's been quite a busy quarter. Really to make sure that we don't lose momentum in this initiative on some of these other activities around generating NAM and the research components. But I recognize we still need to ask the board to approve the working group's terms of reference as we've presented that in agenda item 4B. So with that, I think I am going to turn back to Jeff or Ken to assist in that process. We'll obviously look for feedback and so on, and I think that there's a poll that's been prepared for this after we've worked through that process.
Okay, this is fine. So the board is asked to approve the terms of reference. This is, of course, a group we have already decided to start. This is fine. Do we have a technical voting procedure as to that we can use for this?
We do, Stavros. It's up here now, but I recognize that some board members might also want to provide some comments as well, of course.
We do have some raised hands, Jeff. Why don't you?
Oh, okay, let's look at the raised hands, please.
Yep, so Kim, you're first. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Brian. Clearly, the working group has a lot on its plate, and it seems to be quite, I'd say, quite ambitious on the agenda. I do have a question for you, and maybe you can just help me, I guess, narrow down perhaps some of what the working group is looking to do. So my question goes back to the original survey that was done, and forgive me for not having it in front of me. But did the survey identify areas for which our stakeholders were interested in gathering more information, and wondering if those areas, if they exist, would be appropriate to maybe focus on for the non-authoritative material? And then when I think about, we're talking about perhaps looking at the code and where revisions may need to be made, maybe clarity needs to be had within the code, perhaps for Rich's task force. There's some areas or issues that come to mind, at least for me, that I think maybe stakeholders could use some clarity, and perhaps it's more around the independence aspect of it. So I appreciate that it may just be more profession focused, but perhaps other stakeholders, such as the difference between business relationships versus non-authoritative, NAS, products versus standards. These are questions that stakeholders struggle with, and perhaps we'll make some revisions in the code to that, but wondering if those types of issues have been thought about in the priority of the non-authoritative material, and if there is a link back to the survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Next, we have Lisbeth.
Yeah, I was having similar thoughts as Kim, actually. It's not yet clear to me what the content of this NAM material is going to be about. When it says auditor independence, that is, well, extremely broad. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's very obvious based on the survey results that there are areas that are still very unclear in the code and where stakeholders can use help with. And for me, similar to what Kim was referring to, I have same thoughts, but also hosting is one that it's not addressed in the code. And it's a question that we're getting on a daily basis. And okay, we have as a firm, we have our interpretations. And I think that can help with to draft NAM that can be of use for other stakeholders. But I'm not clear at this point what non-authoritative material you're going to be producing, because the 4 areas you noted down are extremely broad. And then another point I had on the terms of reference, more specifically the paragraph 20, and it's similar to a comment I made yesterday as well. It is the board's input is only going to be offline through a fatal flaw. Well, you like to use the term complexity and complicated. Well, technology and applying the interpretations of the NAS in the context of technology is extremely complex and complicated. So I don't think this is something we're going to be able to get through offline through emails. I think a lot of these topics require decent debate at the board so that we can get to a right position before we issue this very important material to the stakeholders.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I don't have any raised hand at this stage, so Brian, maybe back to you.
Yeah, happy to address those, and thanks for the questions. In terms of the prioritization, so Kim, you had referenced the survey and to what extent the survey would be involved. So I'd refer you to paragraph 10 of the terms of reference, and the survey very much formed part of our list for NAM and potential NAM topics that are being considered. And leave it, I guess, along the same lines. I guess, as I mentioned on that slide with the 4 really broad buckets and topic areas, that was really just a matter of space. And my reference is to take a look at Appendix A within the terms of reference and the auditor independence. There's some subcategories that have been included there. Again, those are coming out of, if I jump back up to paragraph 10, they're coming out of the survey, they're coming out of the phase 1 final report, they're coming out of outreach from commentary received by whether it's the IESBA or through CAG or what have, or Forum of Firms, I know contributed as well. So all of those things combined into the draft list that we have there. And what we're looking for is to add to that list, to scope out, to think about what the priorities might be. And then just in terms of the involvement of the board, I would agree that if there's contentious issues where the working group and, let's say, Kim's group, if we're talking about independence, non-authoritative materials. So if there's contentious issues where the members of those 2 working groups are saying, I'm not sure if this is the right thing to say and so on, those seem like things that you would want board input on. But if collectively the groups, especially because we're talking about not standards, we're talking about non-authoritative guidance and education materials, and where one might look if you're in this case an auditor within the existing standards for guidance around particular topics, and in my case related to technology issues. I'm not sure that that's something that requires board time, other than through the review process like has been done with the COVID materials, because there is a review process, and surely if through that review process board members were to say, like, put the brakes on here, hang on, think that you're actually, issuing pseudo requirements or something like that, those would be definitely things that would alert us, and not something then that the group and staff, because of course our staff is involved in this process as well, would say that doesn't matter, let's issue it anyway. So I think there's a number of checks and balances through that process. But spending board, I guess the thought is, right, and this is a more general thought that I'll let Stavros speak to, but I think that the imagination is, if we're not putting a standard out there, there's a different process involved. And this seems to be the right touch of the process. But I can see Stavros already has his hand up, so I'll hand it over.
Thank you. Yes, I really don't think this is worth too much discussion. I sympathize with what Lisbeth said. There may be items in the non-authoritative material that might be worth discussion at the board. But we don't have to constrain ourselves one way or another at the start. I think there should be judgment as the items arise. Nor should we make a rule that every NAM comes to the board, because we have time problems at the board. So perhaps we should have some flexibility there, Brian, I mean, don't make it it's usual that this is not brought to the board, but it may, and it's a question of judgment I would say on a case-by-case basis.
I'm in complete agreement with that approach, and I know this decision doesn't just impact our group, right? This impacts other things, but we tried to get to that with the wording of paragraph 20. We're anticipating that things will sort of flow smoothly. Definitely, if it's contentious and problematic, that would be something. Well, we might ask ourselves why we're producing that material then, if it seems like it's something that needs to run through a more formal process. But I completely agree on the case-by-case evaluation of it.
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Chairman, we don't have any other raised hands from board members, so.
Okay, so we can go back to the ask for the board to approve the terms of reference on the condition of this by case note.
And that would be my recommendation, Mr. Chairman, that we make a slight addition to the terms of reference to just recognize this point precisely.
Yes.
Before we do that, I'm just going to ask our PLB observer, Jane Diplock, to make a comment. She has her hand raised.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to make a couple of points. The PIOB has been thoroughly enthusiastic about the technology project from the start, and is very interested in the development of this project. And I think, having listened to the conversation, that we will perhaps have to think about just how I'm not suggesting that we wouldn't support the delay in the process that's been outlined. We would, but I do think that there is an issue with the strong suggestions in the strategy and work plan on technology, and some messaging needs to be at least addressed as to why this delay has happened. The two issues that have been raised, which are COVID and feedback from the profession about the problems of COVID, I think are well recognised. But at the same time, COVID has had another effect, and that is to actually accelerate the use of technology in virtually every aspect of life. And I feel absolutely sure that in the profession, the auditing profession, this is not an outlier in this respect. So I think there is a balance to be thought about in the pace of change that's occurring in technology, both in the use of technology by the audit profession and in the developments in technology underlying business models of companies that are being audited. So both of these elements are accelerating, and I think if we need to have that in mind if we're addressing the urgency of the material that's being produced by IESBA. A second point I just want to make is looking at the surveys, the first survey and the second survey on complexity and on auditor independence. I think in any work that goes forward, and particularly this non-authoritative guidance that's being canvassed, there needs to be specific outreach to investors, those charged with governance, regulators and others, because if you look at the responses to the survey, quite understandably, since this matter goes to the very heart of the audit professional business model, the majority of, by far, the majority of responders were from the professions or professional organisations. And looking at the list of potential collaborators that the working group listed, most of them still fall within this category. And I do think there's a wider interest in this issue from the investment community. Now, they may not have responded as quickly or at all to the two surveys, but that doesn't mean necessarily that their interests, I put that in the broadest public interest point of view, are not necessarily, will not necessarily need to be addressed. And I was delighted to see that the Institute of Electrical Engineers, I'm sure I haven't got that name absolutely right, were responded. But I do think that the data science providers, the data aggregators, the companies that are working in the data area are very important, because they are they're part of this accelerating developments, and it would be very useful to have a look to them. But similarly, the number of products that are now being developed at a rapid rate for investors and for corporates to facilitate their own business models is also very important. So I think perhaps further thought needs to be given to exactly who needs to be reached out to in these circumstances. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. There's no other comments, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead with the poll. Thank you. Just one comment to what Jane said, which is correct. We have actually, I think it's pretty natural that in the type of survey we circulated, which went to essentially finding out how the accounting profession faces all the complexity issues and so forth, it was rather natural that we got the kind of responses that we did. But just for your information, I think we have said this to the PIOB too, we have planned, in fact, in a couple of weeks' time, a presentation of our technology project to the IFIAR people, because I, for one, think that audit inspectors are the ones who are more closely related to the type of thing we are looking for. So your point is well taken and well appreciated.
Brian, you would like to respond to Jane's comments as well?
I did, yeah, just a couple of points, and thanks, Jane, for your comments. They're very valuable. In terms of the accelerating tech through COVID, completely agree with you that I think we've all seen that, but certainly we've seen that through the lens of the technology initiative and the work that's happened. I think that that issue kind of is co-joined with IESBA's decision to add resources to the tech initiative and have these two branches as full groups, rather than trying to compress that all within the work of the tech task force. And so I think that's beneficial. Something that we haven't mentioned today, and it wasn't deliberately part of our presentation, but not for any reason. There is a communication that has been drafted already in terms of the changes that we've talked about today. And of course, it will take on the updates based on today's conversation. But that's something that's going to be sent out to stakeholders in terms of explaining the rationale on some of those points that you made. And so I think that's useful, and I believe that's being targeted for release next month. And then also just around the outreach specifically to investors and so on and so forth, I would agree in looking at the survey results, and I know Rich will get to this, but I was disappointed by the lack of response from some stakeholder groups, notably the regulatory community. I thought that was sort of unusual. I will say the investors, those charged with governance, they tend not to be as engaged with the work that we're doing. It is something that we should target. To that end, I think that would also be something that we can deliberately add in. I know we're thinking about it, but we can deliberately add that into the proposed terms of reference for when we're putting NAM together, that we can have more of a deliberate look at that. I think you remember on one of the slides, we're going to look at speaking with the Institute of Corporate Directors, the Institute of Directors, kind of different names at different jurisdictions, but that will at least hit one of those groups. But and there's a very active member of the CAG who represents the investor, or one of the investor networks. And so I think there's an opportunity there as well. But I think you're right. I think we can be more explicit about that. So thank you.
Okay. I think we can
Yes.
now proceed. We can now proceed. You have on your screen a form that asks you to submit your vote for, against, or abstain. Can you please check your choice? This is for the terms of reference with the amendments that Brian suggested. Okay. So do you have it?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
on the screen.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, we have 16 for and 1 abstain. So there's 17 board members today. As Ian has sent his apologies earlier. So everyone has voted.
Good. Thank you
16
very much.
for again.
Okay. So Brian, have you concluded, or you have something more to add here?
No, that's it for me. I will turn over the stage to Rich to carry on. Thank you, everyone.
Well, I would suggest that we can take a break now.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's take a break for 15 minutes, please. And when we come back, we'll hear Rich for the remainder of this presentation. So
I suggest we come back at 20 to the hour, so whichever time zone you're in.
Yes,
so
20 to the hour, right. I was trying to figure out the New York time.
Yeah.
That'll be 6:40 New York time.
Okay, it's too late for me to figure out such things.
3:30 a.m. where Sanjeev is at.
Okay, break, please. Thank you all. Okay, we're back. We're all here, I believe.
Yes.
So let's proceed. Richard, may I ask you to take the floor?
Certainly, thank you, Stavros. We're going to cover the 2 surveys, and we'll start with the complexity survey and then move over to the survey on the impact on auditor independence. If we could move forward to slide 20. And it's interesting, Jane's question right before the call was actually something I had in my notes. For reasons probably having to do more with space or not, we did, in fact, as you look at who the responses came in on this survey, get some responses from regulators and some responses from those charged with governance, although in both cases, we would certainly like to see more. And we had one regulator who on the surveys did not want to respond in writing, but was kind enough to sit down and do it verbally with the team, as I understand it. Also on the right side, I would comment that there was nice dispersion around the globe, particularly strong number of responses from Asia Pacific and from Africa, and as always, a healthy amount of responses from both UK and Western Europe and North and South America. Some of the elements of complexity, many people, if we move to the next slide, cited a little bit of everything. Certainly pace of change was very high on people's mind, no surprise there. There were some comments I would say that we didn't summarize here, but are somewhat reflective of the events of the professional environment and frankly all of the environment with related to the global pandemic. And so there were some comments related to that. Resource constraints also continue to be an interesting feedback. And when we get to a couple other questions, some of the things you'll see on this slide would fit in well. I think this just provides a little bit of a context of what people said they experienced. I don't know that there was any shocks in the answer we saw there. If we move to the examples of the complexity, one of the interesting observations here is that the first button talks about technological transformation, and certainly there were references to things like data analytics and RPA and blockchain and AI and a variety of things, some a little more basic Internet of Things and some more day-to-day. But there was a large number of responses that focused on complexity from areas that were not are not technology per se, and a few that were current and responsive. And some of the, and at the top of that list was laws and regulations. Was very high on that list, and we've listed some of the other ones here in the area of estimates. You know, the complexity around the valuations and going concern, and the ECL stands for the expected credit loss models, which is a new standard that is being implemented around the world. Those were a few examples where existing and long-standing areas were cited. There also was some concern about company culture and how the companies addressed cybersecurity, or excuse me, not cybersecurity, but how the companies address complexity. And then, of course, as you might expect, data privacy and privacy in general was an area of significant complexity. So, but it was informative that there was a lot of answers that were not technology focused and helpful. So these might be, this next slide is a little, actually it probably should have come after the slide we'll get to in a minute, but we're going to in a moment talk about the 4 areas that we asked people as options to think about. One of the interesting things was 3/4 of the respondents indicated that they didn't think there were threats not covered by the code, but that there was some feedback that maybe some people may not understand the principles of the code and the application. And then there were others, and that was maybe a little bit of why some of the other themes came out, but there some of the other areas listed for the 26% again were are listed here and are representative things that I don't think were surprising based on the many things Brian and the technology task force has previously talked about. The next slide was an interesting question in that these were the four general broad categories of options. You've seen this described in the papers, the pre-read papers for this meeting. And each of those was given consideration, and each of them got voted for heavily. But interestingly enough, when you looked at options 2 and 3, which would have be amending the existing threats or adding an additional threat, again, 74% indicated that they didn't think there was a need to make changes to the threats that weren't already captured in the other categories. But as we move to the next slide, at the same time, there was a lot of support for some of the options, and interestingly enough, and I don't know if this was some confusion, but there was a number of people who voted for all the options, but then had some comments that tended to direct the other way. I think there's clearly, though, complexity, and I think if you think back to my comments about the types of complexity people are facing, that went well beyond technology, and was maybe a bit more pervasive in the factors that cut around professional judgment and the roles that professional accountants, whether they be in practice or in business, are in. There's clearly was a much stronger support for considering that as perhaps some additional material in as Brian has outlined it previously, some additional materials in the application materials within the code. There did not seem, again, as they took every one of the combined survey answers and broke them down, there didn't seem to be a compelling push at all for adding a threat at this point. And in the CAG, I noted that the people who spoke up on this topic generally advocated for not changing the basic threats in terms of a few cases. But with that, I guess we'll go pause here for a moment on the next slide and see if there are comments or questions from the pre-read on this aspect of the proposal or the survey results.
Thank you, Rich. Comments from the board?
Okay.
Okay.
Do we have anyone?
I don't have any raised hands at this stage.
Okay.
Board members, if you have any comments on recommendation 2 in complexity and what Rich has just shared, please raise hands.
All right.
Anya?
Well, certainly.
We do have one comment. Sorry, Rich, we do have
Yes, go ahead.
We do have one comment.
Okay.
Anya, the floor is yours. You're on mute.
Sorry. It's not exactly a comment on the results of the research, but I'm amazed that you got so lower level of response from the South America. And that's something that I hope to be able to help IESBA with, because in general in South America, we are too much relaxed and leave the work to be done by others. And then we complain because we do not like the results. So I was in a meeting with Argentina bodies this morning, and I hope to be able to touch Colombia as well in a short period. And in the future, I hope that we'll be able to participate more, including Brazil, in this kind of research that is so important for us to have a good diagnosis of what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Anya, there's no other comments, Rich.
Oh, no, but that is a fair comment. I mean, there was I guess 9 responses from South America, so a bit less than the 10% threshold. But I agree, the more outreach we can have, the better information we get as a board to work to address any topics. So maybe if we move to the next slide, actually we've one more beyond that, and maybe even one more. Thank you. Just a little bit of the background of the respondents on the independence survey, or the impact of technology on auditor independence. Again, I'll move to the geographic dispersion. This was again little heavily skewed. Actually, Asia Pac had a healthy amount of 12. North and South, North America had 8, South America had 5, and UK and Eastern Europe had 15, and the rest were spread among a couple others, principally South Africa and India. So we did get dispersion from around the world. Obviously, a much lower rate of response here across the board. In terms of, if we could move to some context, there were some questions asked at the front, which is on slide 30, I'm sorry, where just to kind of get some information, there were really 3 different questions that are reflected in the results on this slide. One confirmed, frankly, there was a very wide range of services and products that people were dealing with or running into or seeing in the marketplace. There was a question about how technology products were developed, and it seemed to be, you can see that in the pie chart on the left. I would say that the feedback was that larger organizations tended to do things themselves. And as you got to smaller organizations, it was more likely that the organization had somebody else helping them in development of technology that they would use. And then the right side, the third question, is really, again, totally unrelated question, just some context, but how do you see these technology solutions or tools or whatever products, whatever you want to call them, distributed? And a little bit of a mix there, but clearly the first 2, it's servicing agreement and license agreements, and there was some indication, I thought, that some of there was a bit of a overlap between those, but those would be the more predominant approaches. So that's just a little context. Let's move to the next slide. This is a summary. I'm gonna have a slide on each one of these I want to talk about. But this is kind of a snapshot, and we use this at the CAG to update them. And you can see there are a number of areas where there were some mixed views, and then some areas where there was some general majority to address. And I'm going to talk about each of those as we go through it. Probably the one that there were 2 that caught my attention. I'm going to start with those right off the top here. The first was on the next slide, please, that 76% considered that you should consider NAS provisions, that they're relevant if you're going to sell or license technology that performs a NAS, which the initial reaction by many when they saw that was great, that you would hope it to be a high percentage. As we've looked at this, frankly, our concern is with the 24% who didn't feel that was correct. And this is an example where, in fact, there was some positive, some recognition about that at the CAG, but this is something where we think NAM is important to make some key points. Maybe this is also an area where we need to do something in the code, because I think in general, there was a belief that if you had a piece of technology that would provide a non-assurance service, that didn't exempt you from complying with the provisions of the non-assurance services categories in the code. And particularly, of course, this survey was before the vote on NAS, and obviously before the release of it. And I'm hoping that the release of the NAS standard, as well as the NAS implementation group, would help close the gap on that 24%. But that's something that definitely, at least I'll say, got my attention from the results. The next item that was also interesting was, as much as we may have talked about in the past about products versus services, a fairly substantial number of respondents said there was no need to categorize something as a product versus a service. Now, some of that may be because a very large percentage on the prior slide already said they think you have to think about NAS no matter what. And so that was interesting. I do think that you can see, like at the bottom here, there was some comments about things like reselling or relicensing products developed by a third party when acting as a distributor, manager, or agent. And that is something that perhaps needs to be thought about in terms of whether we want to address that either in the code or again through NAM. It gets a little mixed after that as we move to the next slide. We clearly had very mixed views with a majority saying no, as are there tech-enabled services that should be more explicitly covered in the code. Some suggested that non-authoritative materials would be a better source for that. At the same time, if a very important point here that others have raised on this during this meeting about things like collecting, storing, hosting client data. I can't remember, someone indicated that was something they commonly dealt with, and issues around frequency and whether frequency of a technology product could change how you viewed the independence ramifications of that. And I think these are still areas that need some consideration as we move forward with looking at possible clarification or change to the code. But also could be areas, as suggested by many of the respondents, that non-authoritative materials could be helpful in. As we move to the next slide, this was the question about the 606 benefit and some very specific questions about terminology. And not to make light of this, but when you see even 23% thought the word other needs defined better, I think it's clear that this is an area where people are struggling a little bit with what is meant. 75% thought there could be better clarification about implement and design. 75% thought customize versus configure need better explained. 63% on what off the shelf means, and 63% on not significant. And again, it's to be determined whether all of this is something that makes it into matters that are addressed in the code, or whether some of this can be addressed through non-authoritative materials. But it was interesting about, frankly, noticeable the number of people who seem to be confused about many of the common phrases used. There was, if we move to the next slide, there was a question on business relationships. It did not ask for a yes or no, and the answers were extremely mixed. In fact, in many cases, every single answer was somewhat unique and not overly focused. But I think in general, there was a little bit of a range there. That seems to be an area where there's a lot of different views. And so I think while it was not in our original, necessarily in the original work plan, I do think there might be some consideration of whether something needs to be done in the code, but also whether there should be some points made in NAM on that. And then tied to what actually was, if we move to the next slide, again, a lot of people believing that that the key determining factor for routine or mechanical is whether it requires technical expertise or professional judgment. There were some factors that came out from a few respondents there. I do think that was helpful to understand what the perspective in the marketplace was. But certainly there's other considerations that go into that. So probably unpacked a lot. I think it's appropriate we maybe take a moment here and let many people speak up on thoughts and views and considerations. The task force would benefit from the broader input on not just what we saw in this survey on independence, but I know we paused on the complexity one, but if you have things you want to bring up again on that, I think it would be helpful if you want to, if we want to, Jeff, open it up for questions, or Ken, I'm sorry.
Jeff.
Board members, if you have any comments on either this aspect, independence, and the survey results, or if you have any additional comments on complexity, please raise hands. I think the task force and working group would really appreciate your feedback at this point.
Do you see any, I don't see any.
Our PIOB observer has a comment, so perhaps Jane.
Sorry, just very briefly. I think these are really important issues in the public interest. And I think that whether they need changes to the code or changes to the non-authoritative information is really a matter that really does need further exploration. I think this question of where a business relationship starts and finishes and what is actually a financial or a non-financial matter is becoming increasingly important with the development of non-financial auditing. So I think these issues must be, I think, brought forward, because I think they're reality today, and people are making those judgments, ethical judgments, without a lot of guidance, obviously, when you look at the results of the survey. And I think that's a public interest matter.
Yeah. Thank you, Jane. Comments from other board members? Please raise hands at this point. Lisbeth?
Yeah, the only point I want to make is that when you look at some of these results, I think it's demonstrating that there is a clear need for non-authoritative material to explain how some of the provisions in NAS actually operate, because especially when I was looking at that slide 33, where 70% are indicating there are pure products, and then they are giving examples that, in my opinion, are actually also including a type of a service, like a technology that provides some generic information to a client. In my opinion, indirectly, you're providing a service by providing generic information. The second one, technology that has no impact on financial systems and controls. Yeah, okay. The conclusions as to whether the threat to independence is high or not might be different, but it's still a technology that is delivering a service to the client. So I'm really puzzled by some of these answers, and in my opinion, this really demonstrates that we need non-authoritative material to explain how technology in a context of a non-assurance service actually operates. And then on the next slide, when I was actually the one who brought up the need for further insights into storing, hosting, blockchain, and so on. These are really areas where practitioners at this moment need support somehow. And I personally am still convinced that our current standards are strong enough, robust enough to deal with these, but I think we need to give some guidance to practitioners so that they understand how to apply them correctly.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Rich, I'll just take a few more comments if that's okay before we ask you to respond. Sanjeev, you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think looking at both the issues raised in the survey, whether it is complexity or the auditor independence, you see very conflicting responses at times. And I think the task force probably needs to deliberate more and come out with non-authoritative guidance. Because as Elizabeth mentioned, I think the practitioners would require guidance here as to what are the thinking from the board is. So that's my only comment, that I think the task force will need to deliberate more on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. We have Kim, then followed by Ken and Mr. Chairman. Kim?
Thank you. Rich, I don't recall whether you were on the board or not at the point in time that the NAS task force brought forward some suggested wording on various areas for technology. Ultimately, it was agreed that we would pull that draft wording out, and that the technology task force or working group at that point would take a look at it. But, you know, we really did talk a lot about whether or not it needed to be included in the NAS standard at that point in time. And I think as far as the NAS task force went, we just didn't have really enough time to explore all of the options and really to study the issue. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm very, very supportive of the task force looking into these areas. There's most definitely confusion, and guidance is needed, whether or not it's non-authoritative or within the code. I think there may be opportunity within the code to make some revisions, or at least to consider, or for the board to discuss whether it's in the NAS section or the business relationship section. It does get complex. There's a lot of factors that come into play. And oftentimes I do find when I look at the code, it leaves me wanting more when I'm trying to make some decisions. So I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I definitely support the task force looking at these areas. I think they are very critical, and practitioners and their clients are struggling with what the right answers are in these areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Kim. Ken?
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, my comment was pretty much along the lines of what Kim just shared. I do believe there is a bit of a vacuum in front of the board. Effectively, the code is quite silent in some of these areas, and there is a clear question that is begging, in terms of really guiding practitioners and thinking about how to navigate some of these situations where they're facing the provision of technology-related services or products, and where they should be situated in thinking about independence. So I do think that there is a need to really dwell a little bit deeper in those areas, dealing with some of those issues. And Lisbeth mentioned some of those types of services, hosting, for example, where there is a lot of question and the code is simply quite silent in those areas. My other comment really was on slide 35, Jeff. I don't know if you could flick, or Cam, if you could flick to that. And the second bullet there, which just struck me as perhaps needing some peeling to really reveal exactly what the point is. I mean, I think it's perhaps too summarized. Autonomy of tech makes human judgment less relevant. I guess I could read that in at least two ways. One is, yes, I mean, if we're thinking about the use of technology to perform routine or mechanical activities, processing of payroll, for example, yes, I mean, clearly there's going to be little need for human judgment. The software will have been programmed and will have been tested and so forth. So that could be one situation, but the other situation clearly would be at the opposite end of the spectrum. If one is dealing with an artificial intelligence system that is really crunching a lot of information and making judgments and decisions autonomously, would one be confident enough to rely on the algorithms that would be really underlying all these judgments and decisions, and basically leaving it to the software to guide potentially quite important strategic decisions for the business? So I would call that into question, and therefore in those situations, I would think it would be all the more important to bring in the element of human judgment. So I think again, there's a bit of need to sort of peel the onion and really get behind some of the comments.
Thank you, Ken. Mr. Chairman, the floor is yours before we pass it back to Rich to address all the comments raised.
Well, I was covered to a great extent by what Kim and Ken said, so I will not repeat that. I was recalling that there had been such discussion from the NAS task force. I have two issues on my mind that I was wondering if I could ask Rich to maybe explain a little bit. Those questions we've been asking, both on complexity and on independence, are very much contingent, number one, on how much exposure those who respond have had to advanced technologies. Number two, on the issue of competence, I mean, I get a feeling that competence levels vis-a-vis new technologies vary quite a lot within the accounting profession, and not necessarily only by size, but geographically as well. So, you know, how do we decide, given such variations, whether we are going to deal with non-authoritative material or adding application material to the code? I don't have it clear in my mind how one would decide that. So I was going to ask Rich if he could share a thought about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rich, the floor is yours.
Okay. Let me address some of the key points. First of all, the points that Jane made, I agree with you. They are important topics. And interestingly enough, the non-financial, you know, we're seeing increasing situations where audit or attestation work would involve non-financial aspects of annual filings or ESG, things like that. I think that is a most relevant thing to think about. In terms of Elizabeth's comments, and that fits with some others, I think the difference between the issue with slide 33, the responses there, goes back to what's on the prior slide, which is, I think the high rate of saying I don't need product versus service differentiation fits with the same large percentage that says, look, I know I have to think about NAS first. I think what we have to work on both these slides is the 24% who didn't think you had to think about NAS first, and the 17% on the next slide that indicated that there are pure products that you might be able to sell to your, I presume that you might be able to sell or deliver to your clients. And I think that's the focus for me, and whether that's NAM or not, I think it's probably NAM to start. That is the most concerning thing I saw in the whole survey, is that there are people who may be interpreting that because I use technology, because one uses technology to deliver something, one doesn't need to think about the rest of the non-assurance services. And I think that's particularly problematic. And I think that's an important element of what might have been going on there has been closed with the efforts from the NAS project. But that's something I agree is very important. And Kim, yes, we are aware of the materials that were worked on, and in fact, just recently, I was looking at those, and those are important consideration as we move forward. I guess Stavros or Ken, I think you addressed the same thing. Ken, that middle slide on 35, if we can shift to that middle bullet. Some of the, I'm just going to say this, some of the responses that, in the way they were summarized, people lost track of what we were talking about. So when you think about the question of auditor independence, that statement is, in my mind, is more of a fact than necessarily an independence issue. But you have to be careful that technology could move into areas that not only are not permittable NAS in general, but could get into management responsibilities. And so I do think that's something that has to be considered as we go through this. And Stavros, I think that might fit a little bit with what you, your point on, as you read the survey responses, Stavros, it's very clear that there were some responses that were far more experienced in understanding of technology and the use of it and how they've seen it in the marketplace and other responses. And so I agree with the issue of the contingent on how much someone's experience has been. And that again might be something that we could do some things through some form of non-authoritative material to help. The competence issue, you know, my personal view of that, and I may not have the perfect answer for you right now on this, Stavros, is that runs across anything when we're talking about professionals in business or in professional practice. If you don't have the competence, that's okay, but you do have an obligation to get it from some other source or get other expertise involved. And I think that's something that we need to think about on how we lay out anything we do here. And that may run to some of the comments and some of the work that the task force did through December back in the materials in the section 120, that we may have to address that there. Because I think we want to emphasize that very much, I agree that if you do not have the relevant competence and you're a professional accountant in business or in practice, you need to get whatever you need in order to be capable of exercising whatever role you're playing in those situations. So, and that may not, and certainly please, if I didn't address somebody's comments or others have come to mind, please jump in now. These are all been helpful comments.
Thank you, Rich. Comments, any other comments from board members? Please raise hand at this point. I don't have any more raised hands, Rich.
Okay. I think that was the extent of what we had prepared. Brian, I don't know if you have anything you want to add at this point.
Brian?
Let's see, Brian.
I had double muted on my phone was muted, sorry. Yeah, no, I think the results of the survey are, I think it's pretty clear on the slides. It's now a matter of figuring out what to do with this. But my interest also is around the significant numbers of people who did not understand something, and that delineation between what should be in non-authoritative and what should be codified is obviously a critical one. And I mean, I think there's also the perception that if folks are reading the provisions in the code and they're not clear, there's an argument to make them clear. If it's the provisions that are not clear, if there's material that we can add to augment, give examples or situations or point them in the right direction within the code, that I think is very suitable for non-authoritative materials. But sorting that out is going to be an important issue so that we're not writing rules outside of the code, obviously, right? So if it's in the code, then fair game. We can absolutely point to it and provide examples of how some particular use case, some scenario that someone's experiencing, we can say, this is where you should go in the code, and that's going to be effective for you. But if we really don't have an anchor point within the code, or it's so broad that we say, you know, well, it's just, you know, you look in objectivity and you should come to this conclusion, and it's really not clear, then it might suggest that application material is more appropriate. They're going to be hard decisions, though.
Thank you for that, Brian. I think this is going to be the hard part too. Thank you for confirming. Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, we just got a comment from Ken.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Galen.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I just wanted to respond very quickly to what Brian just said, and if it can help at all in terms of the thinking or making that call as to whether a response should be through non-authoritative material or through codification within the independent standards. First of all, I would try to think about whether the issue is about really understanding whether the particular situation is about application of the principles in the code. Because if that's the case, then that would suggest perhaps it might be better dealt with for the vehicle of non-authoritative material. On the other hand, if the issue is about clarification of the scope, for example, of the application of the independent standards, the non-assurance services provisions, for example, then that might suggest perhaps that clarification ought to be actually pushed through within the code itself, to really make it very clear that the code or the non-assurance services do indeed cover the particular fact pattern or whatever the issue might be. So I would try to think about how to make that judgment more at that sort of level, rather than through specific cases or specific scenarios or types of services. So it's really about whether it's clarification that's needed. And if it's clarification that's needed, it's about what? Is it about the principle? Is it about the scope? And is it a matter of application that is being raised?
Thank you, Ken. Galen?
Yeah, just following up on what you just covered, Ken, and Stavros's question, it almost seems to me like, and the profession loves frameworks, but formalizing some sort of framework of criteria that goes into that decision-making process would seem to be an appropriate thing to do, so that as we go forward, you would have some rationale as to why something isn't placed in the code, as opposed to the non-authoritative material and vice versa. So I don't know whether the board would consider adding this on to one of these two groups that's going forward, but it seemed to me that would be an appropriate thing to keep in your mind.
Thank you, Galen. Brian, you would like to respond?
Yeah, just briefly, thanks. I agree with the comments that were made. Those are all extremely useful kind of factors that need to be considered in that decision. And I guess another factor that I would throw in there is, as much as we want the code to guide the behavior of PAs and so on, in the back of my mind always is that it's also, and this is the part that I never like talking about, because I never want to be thinking about our professional accounts being in breach of the code, but it is also an important enforcement tool. And so what we have within the code as authoritative is really what is going to be held. The PA is going to be held to that standard for a breach, no breach decision. And so clarity from that perspective is important as well, because I know that, yes, we could force a lot of things into non-authoritative materials, and they will have a significant effect on the behavior and encouraging certain behaviors or discouraging other behaviors of PAs. But on the enforcement side, it really is going to come down to what's in the code, for the obvious reason that it's authoritative. But I think we're all saying the same thing. I don't think that what I'm saying conflicts with what anyone said.
Thank you, Brian. Rich, did you have any comments or on the addressing of the previous comments?
I agree with Galen. We have to have a basis for how we, as a board and as task force and working groups, come to a conclusion on anything as to whether it's in the code or non-authoritative material. So that's a helpful approach. I do think we need to keep in mind that it is a principles-based code, and we want to make sure we emphasize those principles. And I think that's something that can be done, perhaps in some cases, at least initially, through NAM.
Thank you, Rich. Mr. Chairman, we don't have any other raised hands. Oh,
Okay.
Excuse me. We do have one. Caroline.
Caroline.
You're on mute, Caroline.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to, having received Rich's report on the survey, I just wanted to circle back to the timeline that we discussed at the start. And you know, I still feel that it is important, and there's room for us to be covering, you know, and addressing some of these points that as non-authoritative material. And I agree that there is a need to think about whether, you know, in addressing it, does it really sit as non-authoritative material, or whether we should codify in the code and make changes to the code. And I think it does, looking at it, it does support you know, a need for an extension, at least 6 months for both the tech task force and the working group, the tech working group, to work through the split and come to, you know, what would be appropriate in an exposure draft. So I just wanted to go back to where we started. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Caroline. Brian or Rich, did you want to respond to that?
I don't know that I don't have anything to add. I think it's a valid observation.
Yep, nothing for me. Agreed.
Okay. So we don't have anyone else,
No.
Jeff? Okay. No. Okay. I certainly will echo what Caroline just said. I had it in mind too, that given all the discussion we've had, which was very rich, I think that it's a wise and balanced decision to go for a December exposure draft date, and with the timeline that we have. So I want to conclude this by thanking the board for your attention and your great comments, our PIOB observer, Jane, and certainly I want to thank Rich and Brian and the staff, of course, and Misha for the very helpful work for these presentations. So thank you all very much. I'm going
Mr. Chairman, if I could just interrupt, I noticed that Jane had her hand up. Just want to see if you have any final comments before we officially close the meeting.
That's what I was going to ask.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Before concluding, yes. So Jane, please.
Thank you very much, Stavros. Just a couple of points, just quickly on the code versus non-authoritative material issue. It may be that these surveys also strengthen the rationale for the deferral for 6 months, and it may be something that you might want to think about in the communication, because I think the points that were made about the level of understanding of a significant number of practitioners on these areas is a matter of the public interest, and I think it's something that you might be helpful in explaining why moving from the strategy and work plan initially. That's one point. Can I just say, I think that these discussions have elucidated a number of very important public interest issues, and we're seeing the technological revolution move at such a pace that the profession and the stakeholders, including investors and regulators and others in the public interest, have a vital interest in this work. And I do congratulate the team on their elucidation of some very, very important issues in these matters. And I think it's been a meeting conducted thoroughly in the public interest and with a large number of public interest issues arising. And I'm very, very heartened to see the way in which these issues are being recognised, canvassed and addressed. Thank you, Stavros. And thank you for your leadership in this matter. It's very important in the public interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we can now conclude the session on technology. I think that we should all be encouraged by the discussion today that we are on track for producing some good results. So thank you all. Tomorrow, the meeting is at a different time. Ken,
Yes, it's 9 a.m. Eastern time.
9 a.m. Eastern time. Oh, so it's not that far away. I mean, it's
Time for brief news for you, Stavros.
okay, very good. So, thank you all. Have a good rest until tomorrow, and see you tomorrow for the next items on our agenda. Have a good day, evening, afternoon, whatever. All. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Well.
Thank you.